Have you ever wished you could take your words backwards, thrown out in a moment of anger, fear, or pride? Have you ever felt the sting of saying too much, too soon, to the wrong person? Now imagine if, in that crucial moment, you had said absolutely nothing, not out of weakness, not because you didn't know what to say, but because you chose silence. This isn't a meditation cliché. This is war strategy for the soul. In a world where everyone's shouting to be heard on the streets, in boardrooms, on social media, what if the most powerful voice was the one that didn't speak at all? Pause. Let that land. We live in an age of noise, where silence feels unnatural, even threatening. The average American sees over 10,000 ads a day, answers 100 plus notifications, and speaks nearly 16,000 words. And yet, most of us go to bed feeling misunderstood, unheard, exhausted. Something's wrong. We've been trained to believe that the louder we are, the more we matter. But what if that's a lie? What if silence, the kind that comes from clarity, conviction, and emotional control, is the real superpower? Marcus Aurelius knew this over 2,000 years ago. This wasn't a man of empty theory. He ruled an empire during plagues, wars, betrayals. Yet he wrote to himself, "The best answer to anger is silence." He knew that stillness is not the absence of power, it's the essence of it. What if your silence could stop a conflict? What if your silence could expose truth? What if your silence could save you? Most people talk to escape discomfort. Stoics train to sit in it. Because in silence, you discover who you really are. And more importantly, you discover what matters. This series isn't about being passive. It's not about shutting down or running away. It's about reclaiming the most undervalued force in your life, your power to not react. In the next chapters, I'll take you through 9 moments, 9 emotionally charged situations where saying less isn't just smart, it's life-changing. You'll meet everyday people from Seattle to Tokyo who chose silence over self-defense, calm over conflict, and purpose over pride. And by the end, you'll see that this ancient Stoic principle may be the most radical, most necessary practice for surviving and thriving in the chaos of modern life. But before we dive in, if you believe in meaningful content that feeds your mind and strengthens your soul, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It helps this channel grow and gives us the fuel to keep creating powerful videos like this one. Your support means everything. Now, let's test your instincts. Which response shows greater strength in a moment of public shame? A. Defending yourself immediately to correct the misunderstanding. B. Remaining calm and silent, allowing time and truth to reveal themselves. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell us why. Let's see how many of us are already thinking like modern-day Stoics. There's a strange power in not reacting when the world expects you to explode. Caleb felt that tension tighten around his chest as he stood in the conference room of his Seattle office. Months of meticulous design, sleepless nights, and heart poured into a project dismissed with a single, careless critique from a supervisor who hadn't even read the brief correctly. The air felt electric. His teammates looked at him, waiting for a reaction, some validation, maybe even retaliation. But Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't defend. He nodded, took a quiet breath, and said, "Thank you for the feedback. I'll take another look." He didn't lose. He led. There's a kind of maturity that doesn't need to be spoken. Caleb's restraint didn't come from fear or uncertainty. It came from understanding that truth is rarely served in the heat of ego battles. He returned to his desk, refined the work, and within weeks, that same supervisor would be praising it publicly. But that wasn't the point. Caleb's silence wasn't tactically, it was principled. This is the Stoic mindset in action. Silence as power, not passivity. Unfair criticism is not just frustrating, it's humiliating. It attacks not just your work, but your identity. The immediate reaction most of us feel is the desire to fight, to reclaim our dignity. But the Stoics knew better. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "When someone does you wrong, you must understand their mindset and then let it go. Not because they were right, but because your peace is more valuable than your pride." Rita, working long nights behind the bar in New Orleans, knows this firsthand. It was a Thursday. Roadie tourists, long lines, short tempers. One customer, clearly drunk, threw a verbal jab that sliced deep. Something cruel, personal. The bar fell quiet, a moment suspended in heat, and yet Rita's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't rise. She looked him in the eye for a beat, then calmly turned to serve the next person. Later, her manager praised her grace, but that grace was forged through pain. Rita had learned that when you meet fire with fire, you burn, but when you meet fire with stillness, you extinguish it. This isn't about being emotionally numb. Rita wasn't unaffected. She went home that night and cried, but even that was powerful, because she chose where to feel. Stoicism doesn't demand that you suppress your emotions. It demands that you own them. Silence in the face of anger doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough to protect your energy, your values. Anger is seductive. It offers the illusion of power while slowly robbing you of it. Then there's Lucas. Bright, quiet, ambitious. He didn't fit the mold at MIT's tech networking event. While others exchanged resumes, like playing cards, one peer, cocky and animated, dominated the conversation with tales of internships at Meta, bonuses, VC dinners. Lucas listened, smiled, never mentioned the mental health app he had created, an app already being piloted in multiple school districts. He didn't feel the need. Why? Because Lucas wasn't there to win a room. He was there to build a life. The Stoics believed that real strength is invisible at first glance. The oak tree does not shout its growth, it lets the years speak. Lucas knew his value wasn't tied to applause, and that silence. It wasn't indifference. It was rooted in profound security. Boasting, after all, is often a cry for validation, but Lucas had outgrown that cry. He understood a simple truth. The loudest in the room is rarely the strongest. All three Rita, Lucas chose silence not because they didn't know what to say, but because they knew what not to say. They knew that silence could say more. In the storm of unfair criticism, silence is your anchor. In the fire of anger, it is your extinguisher. In the echo chamber of boasts, it is your clarity. The modern world tells you to clap back, to prove your worth, to defend your ego. But the ancient wisdom of Stoicism offers a different path. The path of stillness, awareness, and control. And in that stillness, you just might find the only voice that matters, your own. Some storms begin not with thunder, but with whispers. Sofia first heard the murmurs during lunch break, a sideways glance from a colleague, a half-finished sentence that hung suspiciously in the hallway. She didn't know the full story, only that someone had started one, and her name was at the center of it. In Venice, where community ties are tight and reputations even tighter, a rumor can feel like wildfire in an ancient city. Sofia, a devoted literature teacher who had spent years building trust with students and parents, suddenly found herself under a cloud of suspicion she couldn't quite name. The easiest thing would have been to fight back, to defend, to confront. But Sofia didn't do that. She kept teaching. She showed up, not louder, but steadier. Her eyes didn't flinch when others averted theirs. She didn't chase down the lies. She outlived them, in a culture obsessed with clapping back and clearing your name. Her silence was radical. But that's what integrity often looks like. Unglamorous, uncomfortable, and unwavering. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." He never said to hunt down every lie. He said to live in a way that makes them irrelevant. Sofia did exactly that. And in time, the truth rose to the surface. Not because she shouted it, but because she embodied it. Integrity, after all, doesn't scream. It echoes. Marcus knew this well. Basketball player from Chicago, whose viral moment came not from a slam dunk, but from restraint. During a high-stakes game, an opposing player hurled an insult so cruel that it made the crowd gasp. The cameras caught it. So did social media. Everyone expected retaliation, a shove, a fiery comeback, at the very least a bitter tweet. But Marcus did the unexpected. He thanked the player, walked off the court, and said nothing. No comment, no shade, just silence. It wasn't submission. It was strength. In a world built on reaction, the one who doesn't react becomes unforgettable. And Marcus, through that moment, proved that silence is not the absence of power, it's the control of it. But perhaps the most quietly courageous voice in this story belongs to someone who spoke with data, not decibels. Dr. Ellen had spent decades researching the shifting climate patterns of the Pacific. When invited to present her findings at a high-level summit in Tokyo, she expected debate, but not dismissal. One panelist, lacking any scientific credentials, waved off her presentation with a smirk and a few careless words. That's just one opinion. Ellen didn't take the bait. She didn't rush to rebut or discredit. She didn't insult. She simply paused, let the moment hang, then clicked to the next slide and continued evidence over ego, what she knew and what Stoic thinkers, like Epictetus, championed, is this: it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Ellen's reaction: professionalism, confidence, focus, and later, as journalists and attendees shared their impressions, it became clear her silence had spoken volumes. It was the sharpest contrast to ignorance, not more noise, but calm truth. Whether it's rumors in a school, insults on a court, or ignorance in a global forum, each of these moments asks the same question: will you lose yourself defending yourself? Or will you stand so firmly in your truth that defense is unnecessary? Sofia, Marcus, and Dr. Ellen didn't fight back the way the world expected. They fought by not fighting. They let their actions, their character, and their clarity do the work. And this is the heart of Stoic integrity. Not perfection, but persistence. Not noise, but presence. Not the need to prove, but the quiet certainty that you are already enough in a time where everyone's quick to react, quick to tweet, quick to burn bridges. Imagine the rare power in doing the opposite. Imagine being the one who knows when to be still, when to listen, when to walk away with dignity intact. That kind of silence doesn't just echo, it transforms. Some moments split your life in two, before and after. For James, that moment came in the middle of Yosemite, surrounded by towering pines and granite cliffs that once meant joy. It was where he and his wife built their life through photographs, shared hikes, and the quiet ritual of chasing the perfect sunrise. But after the accident, the silence she left behind was deafening. He didn't speak much in those first few weeks. Friends reached out, messages poured in, but James answered none. Not because he didn't appreciate them, but because grief spoke, a language only silence could understand. Each morning, he returned to the trails not as a photographer, but as a man unlearning what life meant without her. He didn't bring words, he brought presence. And through that stillness, something began to shift. Grief is not something to be silenced, but sometimes, silence is the only place it can fully unfold. In his quiet walks, James wasn't avoiding pain. He was honoring it. The Stoics knew this kind of pain intimately. Seneca wrote, "He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a man who is alive." What he meant wasn't to harden, but to live so deeply that even loss becomes a passage, not an end. For James, silence wasn't about forgetting her. It was about remembering her completely. But not all pressure comes from death. Sometimes it comes from injustice, so loud and public, it threatens to erase who you are. Layla never asked to become the face of a political storm. A community organizer from Atlanta, she had devoted herself to building bridges between police and youth, between protest and policy. But when a protest turned chaotic, headlines twisted the narrative. Overnight, her name was splashed across the screen with words like instigator and agitator. She had proof she wasn't involved. She could have gone live. She could have lashed out. She could have fed the outrage machine. She didn't. Instead, she showed up the next morning at the same community center she always had. She taught conflict resolution. She sat in circles with teens who had watched her on the news and said nothing, just listened. That silence wasn't avoidance, it was strategy, a kind of fierce restraint that said, I know who I am. I don't need to perform. Marcus Aurelius advised, the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. Layla lived those words, not in some philosophical vacuum, but in the fire of public judgment. And over time, people noticed. The outrage faded. Her work didn't. Her silence built a different kind of legacy, one grounded not in headlines, but in healing. And then there's Nathan. You might know him from YouTube, the mental health creator who went viral for all the wrong reasons. A clip taken out of context, misinterpreted, and fed to the algorithm. Overnight, support turned into suspicion. The pressure to respond was enormous. Fans demanded an explanation. Critics wanted a war. But Nathan did something no one expected. He logged off. Not forever. Just long enough to sit with what happened. Not reactively, but reflectively. When he returned days later, his voice was steady, not defensive, but clear. He didn't attack. He didn't deflect. He clarified, and then he listened. The comments under that video didn't just shift, they deepened. People weren't just watching him anymore. They were learning from him because Nathan chose integrity over impulse. In each of these stories, James, Layla, Nathan, we see the same Stoic thread. Silence as sovereignty. In the face of overwhelming emotion, injustice, and public distortion, they chose the hardest path, the quiet one, not because they were passive, but because they were powerful enough to let the world speak, without letting it define them. Grace under pressure isn't just about staying calm. It's about anchoring yourself so deeply in truth that no wave, no rumor, no loss can capsize you. The world may never stop spinning, but within you, there can be a still point, a silence that isn't empty, but full of presence, clarity, and peace. That's the Stoic gift, and that's what these lives remind us. When the pressure is greatest, the most courageous thing you can do is pause and stand still. There's something undeniably sacred about silence, not just as an idea, but as an experience. In an age where every moment is filled with noise, silence has become almost mythical, like a forgotten language we no longer know how to speak. And yet, within that quiet lies a profound intersection between ancient philosophy and modern science. We often think of silence as a void, a gap between sounds. But neuroscience tells us something different. Silence isn't emptiness. It's activation. When the external world quiets, the internal world lights up. Modern researchers have discovered that in the absence of noise, the brain's default mode network awakens. This is the space where we process emotions, integrate memories, and imagine future possibilities. It's the canvas of introspection. In fact, just 2 hours of silence a day has been shown to trigger the growth of new brain cells in the hippocampus, the region associated with learning, memory, and emotion. That's not just poetic, that's physiological transformation, and it aligns beautifully with what the Stoics have always known. That silence isn't about retreating from life, it's about engaging with it more truthfully. When Marcus Aurelius journaled in solitude, when Epictetus paused before responding, When Seneca withdrew to a study, rather than react in public, they weren't escaping the world. They were reconnecting with it, from within. Science and Stoicism converge on one truth. Silence is where we meet ourselves. James understood this in the raw aftermath of grief. His silence on the trails of Yosemite wasn't empty, it was alive with memory and meaning. As he walked those familiar paths without his wife, his mind didn't shut down. It opened. Each step became a prayer, each photograph a meditation. In the quiet, he wasn't escaping loss, he was transforming through it. Layla, too, found strength in silence, not as stillness, but as purpose. As the noise of public judgment swirled around her, she chose not to react, but to redirect. In those moments, her brain wasn't frozen in fear. It was actively reframing, reimagining, and rebuilding. The same neural pathways that drive stress can, with silence, rewire toward resilience. Even Nathan, in his moment of digital exile, experienced the power of what scientists call emotional regulation. By choosing silence over impulsive reaction, he allowed his amygdala of the brain's alarm system to settle. That gave his prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason, the space to guide his next move. When he returned with clarity, his words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were born from stillness. Silence isn't just spiritual, it's strategic, and it's accessible. Try this. Begin your day in deliberate quiet. No phone, no music, just 5 minutes of still breathing. Feel what arises. You might hear your thoughts more clearly, or finally hear what you've been avoiding. Or take a silence walk. No podcast, no agenda, just observation. Watch how your mind begins to slow, how your body synchronizes with the rhythm of your breath, how suddenly without effort you begin to feel more whole. Then there's the practice of the breath hold, pause. When triggered, instead of speaking, inhale deeply. Hold for 3 seconds. Exhale slowly. Those few seconds may seem small, but they change everything. Neuroscience shows that such pauses disrupt the reactive circuitry of the brain and activate mindfulness instead. It's not just calming, it's empowering. Even the act of silent journaling something. Marcus Aurelius. Master gives voice to thoughts that would otherwise rot in the corners of your mind. By naming your emotions privately, you reclaim control over them publicly. Silence, in this way, becomes a laboratory, a forge, a sanctuary. It's where ideas incubate, where pain transforms, and where wisdom blooms. And the most astonishing part, it's always available. Unlike fame, or wealth, or status, silence costs nothing, but it gives everything, especially in moments of crisis, when noise demands your reaction. Silence returns your sovereignty. The Stoics didn't romanticize hardship, they prepared for it. They knew that life would test them not in grand arenas, but in everyday moments. A harsh word, a difficult truth, a personal loss. And they trained for those moments not with speeches, but with silence. Today, the world will tell you to stay connected, to comment, post, respond, react. But what if, just once, you didn't? What if, instead, you sat back, breathed, and chose stillness? What if that stillness didn't make you irrelevant, but invincible? In the lab of your own silence, you're not just healing, you're evolving, and in a world addicted to noise, that might be the most radical act of all. There's a peculiar kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention, doesn't roar for recognition, doesn't rush to defend. It simply exists, sun-shaken, clear, calm. That's the voice of the wise, and more often than not, it sounds like silence. In a culture obsessed with performance, silence is rebellion. It refuses to play the game. It doesn't seek to out-argue, outshine, or outshout. It watches, it waits, and when the time is right, it acts with purpose instead of panic. with direction instead of distraction. This is the voice the world needs. Now not louder, but deeper. Not sharper, but steadier. A voice rooted not in ego, but in essence. When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Don't waste time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one," he wasn't being clever. He was being practical. The wise don't talk about values, they live them. They don't proclaim their peace, they embody it. And they don't prove their strength, they preserve it. That's the legacy James carried in the mountains. Each photograph a quiet testament to love and healing. It's what made Layla so powerful in Atlanta, not because she defended herself, but because she lived so fully in alignment with her mission that the noise couldn't break her. It's what allowed Nathan to return with clarity. Not vengeance, to reconnect with his audience, not through argument, but through authentic presence. These weren't accidents, they were choices, and they were made in silence. We've been taught to speak up at every turn, to never let a challenge go unanswered. But the Stoics offer a different kind of courage, the kind that doesn't need the last word. Because the last word is meaningless when you already know who you are. In silence, there's space. Space to choose your response. Space to preserve your energy. Space to rise above the chaos rather than get dragged into it. That space is sacred and powerful. But here's the paradox. Silence isn't quiet. Not really. In silence, everything inside you becomes louder. Your fears, your doubts, your unfinished truths. And that's where the real work begins. You sit in that space long enough, and something happens. You begin to hear what truly matters. You stop reacting. You start listening. You begin to sense the difference between what demands your voice and what doesn't deserve it. You stop chasing validation and start living from values. You stop defending yourself and start defining yourself. That's what Stoicism teaches, not silence for its own sake, but silence as a vessel, a carrier of discernment, a container for truth. Because when you can pause instead of lash out, listen instead of argue, observe instead of compete, something extraordinary unfolds. You don't just become more composed. You become more complete, and it's contagious. People feel it. They notice when someone isn't flustered by criticism, isn't shaken by drama, isn't enslaved by attention. They may not say it, but they sense it tend. They're drawn to it. In a world that constantly pulls people toward reactivity, you become an anchor. That's how change happens, not through loud declarations, but through silent demonstration. Imagine what would happen if more of us chose this path. If more of us responded with grace instead of defensiveness. If more of us learned to sit in discomfort instead of escape it. If more of us practiced the pause, not to stall, but to find direction. This isn't about silence as withdrawal. It's silence as leadership. Every time you hold your tongue when it burns to speak, you're leading. Every time you listen more deeply than you respond, you're leading. Every time you stay grounded when the world spins wildly, you're leading. And leadership, in its highest form, is what Stoicism has always been about. So the next time life provokes you, when the critique stings, the injustice burns, or the rumor spreads, remember this: you don't need to match the volume of the noise. You only need to remember the sound of your own values, and that sound often speaks loudest in silence. You don't always need to be heard to be powerful. You don't always need to explain to be right. And you don't always need to speak to be wise. Sometimes, the wisest thing you can do is be still long enough for the noise to pass, so that what truly matters can rise and be known. And when that moment comes, you won't just have found your voice, you'll have become it. Looking back at the lives we've stepped into: Caleb in Seattle, Rita in New Orleans, Lucas at MIT, Sofia in Venice, Marcus on the basketball court in Chicago, Dr. Allen in Tokyo, James among the trails of Yosemite, Layla standing firm in Atlanta, and Nathan behind the camera lens of a misunderstood moment. One truth rises above all else: silence. When rooted in wisdom, is not a void, it's a force. Each of these individuals faced situations that would test anyone's limits, criticism that pierced pride, anger that threatened to spill over, boasts that begged for competition, rumors that wounded without cause, insults hurled to provoke ignorance flaunted without shame, grief that hollowed the heart, injustice too loud to ignore, and public judgment that painted pictures of someone they weren't. And yet, none of them chose the obvious response. They chose the inner path, one that is harder, quieter, and far more powerful. Caleb didn't defend his work, he refined it. Rita didn't lash out, she stood grounded in grace. Lucas didn't match arrogance, he let his humility speak volumes. Sofia didn't chase rumors, she rose above them. Marcus didn't clap back, he walked away with dignity. Ellen didn't argue with ignorance, she let facts speak. James didn't drown in sorrow, he honored it in stillness. Layla didn't perform for justice, she embodied it. Nathan didn't rush to fix an image, he paused to reflect, then returned with truth. In all of these stories, the turning point wasn't something they said, it was the moment they chose not to. That's the power of silence. Not the silence of fear, but of freedom. Not the silence of hiding, but of holding. Not the silence of avoidance, but of anchored presence. We live in a world that values noise, likes, comments, retweets, arguments. We're rewarded for how fast we can respond, how sharp we can strike back, how loud we can make our voice heard. But these characters, these real reflections of who we all could be, remind us that true strength is not found in how much we say, but in what we can hold back. They remind us that silence is not just a reaction, it's a revelation. So what's the lesson? It's this: when life shakes you, don't rush to fill the space. Let silence settle the dust first. Let your anger cool before it speaks. Let your wounds breathe before they bleed into someone else. Let your values echo before your voice does. Stoicism isn't about pretending nothing hurts. It's about knowing where to put your pain. It's about turning toward it with open hands and saying, "You will not control me." And that begins with silence. But this silence, this powerful, focused, purposeful silence is not passive. It leads to action, thoughtful action, grounded action. Whether it's making a decision with clarity, ending a conflict with restraint, or leading others by quiet example, silence creates space for something rare, self-respect. In today's world, that's not just helpful, it's revolutionary. So, how do we apply this? Start small. Before you reply to that text that makes your blood boil, pause. Before you jump into a debate online, breathe. Before you try to outshine someone, ask yourself why you need to. Instead of reacting, return to yourself. Ask, is this worthy of my peace? Is this true to who I am? Will this matter tomorrow? Because when you move from that place, not from pressure, but from presence, you stop being controlled by life and start leading it. And now we turn it over to you. What do you think? Have you ever faced a situation where silence would have served you better than speech? Or maybe you have a story where silence helped you grow, reflect, or even protect your peace. We'd love to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Just type A if you've experienced the power of silence in your own life, for B if you're still learning how to use it and want to grow. Either way, your voice matters here, and your silence, too. And if this story moved you, it gave you something to think about, something to hold on to, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us grow, helps us continue making content that goes beyond the surface, and fuels us to bring more of these timeless lessons into your everyday life. Because in a world that talks too much, we all need more space to hear what matters. Thank you for being here and for listening. See you in the next lesson.